This is a 2000 Chevy Silverado 5.3 liter. I'm getting ready to pull the engine out of it. You'll see that I've kind of got a lot of it already taken apart. This truck is a total loss. I'm parting out the front. I'm parting out as much as I can to recoup some of my costs. I bought the truck specifically for the engine and for the transmission, so I'm in the process of pulling it out. Part of pulling it out, you don't necessarily have to, but in my case, you can. I'm going to pull the intake manifold off simply because I don't want to take the chance of damaging it. First of all, what you'll see here is you'll see that this is the cable-driven setup. The newer models, I think 2004 up, they have a sensor instead. They don't use the cables. And so what I'm going to do is this is the way I take the intake manifold off. I'll kind of go through and see. I'll let you know what I do. So the first step I've done is I started by removing the intake and all the air filter stuff. I've got all that out of the way. I also went and I disconnected the throttle cable and the cruise control cable. This one's the cruise control cable. It's a bit of a challenge. It's kind of a U clip in here that you have to pry back. I just kind of found myself a little sharp pointy screwdriver or something. I pried back and it just comes right off with a little knob that's here. For this thing, it just wraps around. You open your cable, open your throttle wide open, and there's a little hole here that it just kind of slides into. So you can just pull that out, and then that's loose. The other thing I will do is I will start labeling all my wires. I'll label the EGR wire. I don't bother labeling the intake fuel injection sensors simply because they're pretty obvious what order is. And you'll see that I've already pulled off the coil pack, and there's only the one connector for it, so it's pretty obvious, so I don't bother marking it either. And on the other side, there's this unit here, some type of vacuum setup. I just mark it something so that I know where it is. Let's see if I can get in the picture. I just make sure I mark this vacuum setup, so then that thing can get unplugged. I've also made myself up a number of other labels that I'll mark as I pull the wires off. This one is your idle air controller, also known as the IEC. Below it is the throttle position sensor. I mark that TPS. In the back of the alternator, there's a clip that plugs in there. I call that alt. There's another alternator wire, and I also mark that one alt. Then again, you have the other coil pack wire, which I've already pulled off. You have a coolant temperature sensor that goes into the block. So I've disconnected that. And at the back of the engine, you have this one right here. See if I can get it in the picture. That one there is your NOx sensor. And then the one right at the very back here, that's your manifold air pressure sensor. So what I will do is I will label all those wires, and then I will unplug all the clips, and we'll continue on from there. So now that the wires are labeled and unplugged, we're going to start with this little knob on top. You can see that it kind of pokes out one side and there's kind of a rounded end on the other. What you do is you push that rounded end, push down. I'm not sure if I can do this one-handed, but it should be able to. And it just pulls off. That thing took me forever one day to try to figure out how to get that thing off. It's actually pretty easy once you know. That's the whole trick. With the throttle cables, as I said, I've already got them disconnected. There's these little pins that you have to push in to get them to come out. You can either do a screwdriver and do them one at a time, or I'm going to try doing a pair of pliers one-handed and see how that goes. Oh, there we go. And you push it back and pull it out. And do the same thing for the throttle cable. Get in there and squeeze it. Try to squeeze one side in and then get the other side. And if you're really lucky, maybe you can get them both at the same time. Doing this one-handed is a little difficult. Screwdriver maybe? Okay, well, I'm going to get that done off camera, but essentially, yeah, you just push the little clips in, push the cable back, slide it out of the slot. I'll do that off camera. And then Fuel injection. These things also took me a while to figure out how to do. And what it is, I don't know how well I'll get that on camera, but what it is there's this kind of a gray clip. You just take it and you pull that straight up. Oh, came right out. That's fine, no big deal. And then inside there's a little notch. Let's see if I can get back up with the camera. So the gray clip's been pulled up. I pulled it up a little further than it needs to be. It doesn't need to come all the way out. But you'll see that there's a little black plastic pin that's right in here that you just squeeze, you push down, pull up, and off they come. Again, it's pretty easy once you know what you're doing. Here's a black clip, and the gray thing actually slides over there, and it acts as a lock to prevent the fuel injection from coming off. So you can do that to disconnect all the four on this side and also the four on the other side. So I have the fuel injection wires disconnected on both sides, and as I said on this side as well, I've got them all disconnected. So here are all my fuel injection wires. The other thing too is with the NOx sensor. With the NOx sensor, I made sure I unplugged it. I unplugged it, but then there's also the second side of it. Oh, pretty dark. There's a second side of it that I also unclipped right off of the intake manifold, because that's the wire that goes down to the NOx sensor, which is located underneath the intake manifold. The next thing I did was I pulled these two 10mm bolts, which is a plate that holds the throttle on, and I undid those. And now you'll be able to pull your whole throttle cable assembly back and out of the way. Oh, I forgot to disconnect that. So you'll pull that out of the way. Then once you do that, you'll disconnect a couple of the clips that hold this main wiring harness in place, and then you can work the entire harness out and then lay it over onto the driver's side of the vehicle. So now that I removed the two bolts, and then I pulled the throttle cable assembly back out of the way and just kind of hooked it on whatever I could to get it out of the way. I also was getting ready to pull the harness out of the way. I realized the harness goes to both sides of the vehicle, so all you can do is pull it up somewhere so that maybe you can attach a wire to your wiper arm or something to kind of pull it up and hold it out of the way. There was one more nut that needed to be removed. That's part of the plate for the wiring harness, so I removed that. And now I should be able to pull the wiring harness and tie it off somewhere to get it out of the way. I'm going to pull all the wires that I've labeled and marked, pull them out, get them neatly out of the way, and then I'll proceed to the next step, which will be to disconnect the fuel line. So before doing the fuel line, I decided I'm going to pull the EGR tube. So this thing, I'm going to pull the EGR tube, so it's a 10mm bolt. I'll take that 10mm bolt and that tube just slides out. A good chance what I will do is I will totally disconnect the EGR from the head so that the pipe doesn't get crimped as bad. It's a little bit more flexibility and allows me to move it around a little bit more without damaging it. So that'll be the next thing I will do. There was two 15mm bolts holding the EGR to the block. There's one here and then there's one underneath. I removed those. I also removed the 10mm bolt there, and now you can just kind of pull it out. It's out of the way. I also realized that I forgot one other thing in terms of the instructions. You have to drain some of the coolant. There is a tube that comes from the bottom of the throttle body, and it actually runs to your radiator. It runs coolant through your intake. And I think it just runs coolant through your throttle body, and it actually also runs down to some tubes that run underneath and into your heads. So there's a tube there that you have to disconnect off your radiator. You might be able to just pull it and plug it without actually draining your whole thing, I'm not sure. And then you'll see later on I'm going to pull the alternator, and there's a tube in behind that we have to disconnect as well to allow us to pull the whole throttle body off. So I forgot about the whole coolant thing too, right? Because I have this engine half apart, I missed that step, and that's one of the very first steps you should be doing. So the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect the fuel system. Oops. Before you disconnect the fuel lines on the driver's side of the vehicle, you want to release some of the pressure. There's a little access cap that you take off, and then just using a flathead screwdriver and a rag, kind of get that in there and you push it to help release the pressure. Use the rag to keep the gas from spraying everywhere. But you want to release the pressure so that when you disconnect your lines on the other side, you don't have fuel spraying everywhere. There we go, pressure's released. So then off to the other side. I'll put my cap back on. So for access, it's easy. It's easiest if you pull this tube out. This tube goes to the top of the valve cover. It's your PCV, positive crankcase ventilation. Once that's removed, you can see the two fuel lines. One is a supply, one is a return. They're different sizes, so it isn't a concern for you to mix up the two lines when you reconnect. You just use a screwdriver to kind of get in and pry the little safety retainers off. And it just slides back, comes off, and then we do the same thing on the bottom one. Pop it back, and just slide it back and slide it off. So now that those are loosened, you have to use a special fuel line disconnecting tool. I picked this up at Princess Auto, but Harbor Freight in the States, they carry this little tool. It has different sizes for different fuel lines. And what you do is you slide that on, slide it in, and you kind of push and pull at the same time. And I'm going to have a very tough time doing this with one hand, but so what I'm going to do is I'm going to see if I can mount it somehow. Hang on. Okay, so I've stuck the camera on a stand, and I'm going to use my tool to pull the line off. So I've got the tool on there, I crimped it on, you push it, you crimp, push, pull. It's supposed to, not coming. Line one, so sadly it leaks gas all over the place. And you go down to the lower one. And in this case I'm using a smaller size. And it comes off too. So you got the two fuel lines disconnected. I don't know how well you can see that, but it's really all comes down to using this little special tool that slides in, helps push the locking clips back so that you can pull the line off. So the next step I'm going to do is pull the alternator off. It's just easier to have the alternator out of the way. There's a couple of tubes you need to get at. It makes it easier to get at the bolts. It's just a good idea to pull the alternator. You'll see that the serpentine belt has already been removed. You do that by working on the tensioner on the one side to work the belt off. So you'll see that I'm going to cheat here because I have an impact that I have to plug into the air. And I'm going to use that to pop the two bolts that are on the bottom of the alternator. They're 15 millimeter. Pull them out. Once they're removed, you get some type of prying tool and just kind of slowly work the alternator up. You just kind of jiggle and pull, and eventually it'll come right off, and you have your alternator off. So that gives you a lot of nice access to this tube here, and then we're good to go. So you'll see at the bottom of the throttle body there's two hoses. There's this hose that's in my hand that comes right from underneath, runs out. It went to the radiator, and then you have the hose on the other side of the throttle body, right in here, and you can see that there's a clip here. So you've got to squeeze that clip and work the hose back. You need to disconnect that. Those lines have coolant in them, so you may get a little bit of coolant leakage. That's why you either drain your radiator, or you can drain your radiator down a little ways, or you can maybe just try pulling the line and plugging it. I would suggest you probably drain some of the coolant instead. So I'm going to do that next. So I've finished disconnecting the coolant lines that go to the throttle body. So I'm just taking a look along this side. I've got all the wires disconnected. Everything's clean. This is wide open. We're good here. I realize there's one little tube that goes to the valve cover, so we'll just kind of work that one off. So that one's out of the way. There's that one long tube that came from the bottom of the throttle body that went to the radiator. Because it was disconnected at the radiator, I'm just leaving it loose as it is, so it's a big long tube that goes there. On the front, all the wires are disconnected. This is the little tube that I had to pull the clip back. Lighting's kind of lousy, but this is the tube that I pulled the clip back. This is the other coolant line that went to the tubes that run underneath the intake manifold. On this side, I've got all the wiring disconnected. I have pulled the wiring harness back out of the way. I have also unplugged the PVC valve that went into the back of the valve cover. So everything's disconnected. Now it's time to pull or undo the, I believe, 10 bolts that hold the intake manifold on. Once you pull those 10 bolts off, you pull the intake manifold off, and it's a happy day. Okay, final step, let's take it off. The torque sequence for the intake manifold when you do the reassembly is to go from the middle to the outside. So when I take it apart, I try to do the opposite. I try to go from the outside back to the inside, and I alternate sides. These things aren't particularly tight, so it shouldn't be particularly difficult to do. So first thing I'll do is I'll just go around and I'll loosen them all. So once they're all loose, you could make sure you can just kind of lift up on them. Then you know that the threads aren't catching anymore, and you'll be able to work the intake manifold off. Working the manifold off is quite easy. The only thing is you have this hose here, and this hose kind of causes you some grief because it runs between some lines. So as you lift it off, you have to work that hose through and out. I'm just verifying that I have everything disconnected. Looks good, and here we go. What's up? Get the jar out of the way a bit better. The hose out of the way. Start pulling out. Oh, something's catching. What am I catching? I was catching on this silly tube. Work that tube out. Oh, forgot to remove my brake booster. Brake booster right here off your brake booster hose, and then there it is, intake manifold. Now that the manifold's off, you have easy access to your knock sensors. I see that these ones have been replaced sometime in the past. That's perfectly fine. I kind of thought this intake manifold had been off before, and that is why. They replaced the knock sensors. And we're done. Done deal.